Let's now look at the last topic of our conversation, is the multi-tenancy. So while we were talking about controllers, right, and we were talking about the vSmart, the vManage, the vBond, those are the control and management elements of the Cisco SD-WAN solution. Now the question is, and we kind of touched on that earlier, the question is, do we deploy those on a per tenant basis, or do we have a multi-tenant system that we can onboard those customers into, right? So it's a very kind of a fundamental question. When we have the cloud delivered service, obviously we do this in a multi-tenant fashion. When we're talking about a customer that wants to launch the service as their own, they want to act as a service provider to their internal organizations, they may start acting as a service provider in a single tenant or a multi-tenant environment, right? Obviously, partners that launching the service have to make a decision whether they want to do this single tenant, multi-tenant, or a mixture of both. There's really nothing that precludes you from doing both. You can have one set of control infrastructure that is a multi-tenant, and you have another set of control infrastructure which is a single tenant for some of your higher end customers, right? So the multi-tenancy plays kind of a very fundamental role when planning the service delivery. So if we think about what are the three concepts or three ways of looking at multi-tenancy. So the first one, I call this dedicated tenancy, which is a clever way to say no tenancy, no multi-tenancy, right? So what we're really talking about here is dedicated tenancy, no multi-tenancy. So here are the three elements we've seen before, right? This is the vBond, this is the vSmart, this is the vManage, right? vBond, vSmart, vManage. As you can see, they have been instantiated for every single customer. So in this case, we're saying customer A, customer B. A complete set of those got instantiated. Now, where have they been instantiated? That takes it back to the beginning of the conversation. Could be Cisco Cloud, could be partner compute environment, could be an on-prem customer data center. Wherever they have been instantiated, whatever x86 platform they run on, they can operate in this mode, which is the single tenant mode in this case, dedicated to an individual tenant. The tenant could be a customer in a service provider environment. A tenant could be an organizational unit within an enterprise. Could be finance and HR. They could be treated as separate tenants. Whatever the operational model that wants to be chosen. Now, there's representation of VPNs is something that is less evident in this particular case. But if you think about the segmentation capabilities of the Cisco SD-WAN, you have the VPN as a per tenant context. As you can see, tenant A, for example, I have those VPNs in tenant A. And then I can have tenant B basically have a different, even though the VPNs may overlap as far as numbering is concerned, they're completely isolated because tenant A is separate from tenant B and relies on different control infrastructure, right? And as we talked about in here, all the elements are dedicated to a specific customer, and it's supported in all deployment models, like we mentioned, on-prem, cloud, or partner delivered, and VPNs can optionally be used to segregate further the traffic. Really nothing unique about this one. Instantiate per customer. As we said, financial customers may require that. They may not want to share because of their compliance reasons. They may go on-prem, but in addition, they may not want to share. Right? So there's things that have to do with scalability. There's things that have to do with compliance, right? So that's the multi-tenant model, which has basically no tenancy, single tenant. If we were to look at the second option, it's a VPN tenancy model. Not particularly popular. Some may not even view that as a form of multi-tenancy, but it is that could be viewed as a multi-tenant environment. In this case, you can see that we have a single set of controllers, yet we have both customers or both tenants as A plus B instantiated within this environment. When you look at how it actually gets manifested in the network itself, you can see that tenant A shares the same VPN, VPN1, but then you see the tenant B has a different VPN. So they are under the same system, So they are under the same management, and control, yet the VPN ID is the unique identifier. Hence, what we call the VPN as a tenant, right? Now, all control elements are shared across customers because they're all just VPNs within the same tenant. Again, it's supported in all deployment models, and this is the caveat that we need to be cognizant about, is that the way that we have this today, VPN is not treated as a tenant in a more traditional term, right? So when a service provider, a partner, or even an organization themselves want to deploy the model where they want to treat VPNs as a separate tenant, they have to be mindful that from the standpoint of the vBond, vSmart, and vManage, these are not truly treated as multiple tenants, which means if you're not careful with your operations, when you're defining policies and you're pushing policies, if you're not careful around which VPNs these policies are active on, you could inadvertently push a certain policy, a certain behavior that would span multiple VPNs, hence impacting multiple tenants, and it's much easier done in a true multi-tenant fashion, which is going to be our next conversation. So we did have certain conversations with managed service providers that wanted to treat VPNs as tenants, yet they have to be mindful that it is recommended to have some sort of a service orchestration capabilities in order to build on top of vManage, particularly on top of vManage, and expose a user interface which would be treating VPNs as tenants. So when you perform a certain functions, vManage itself may not be 100% aware that VPN is a tenant, but by exposing this user interface and modified user interface from the one that vManage by default exposes, you can force a certain operational flow that would prevent somebody from just inadvertently taking actions on VPNs that they didn't really intend to do, right? So that's what I mentioned in the beginning. It's not necessarily a very predominant model. And mostly when people talk about multi-tenancy and a true multi-tenancy, then they usually refer to the last model that we have, which is the true enterprise tenancy. This is a true multi-tenant model. In this case, if we were to look at what happens in here, we have our vBond, vManage, and vSmart. As you can see, we have two tenants, A and B, right? Certain elements of the solution, such as vBond and vManage, are multi-tenant. In our multi-tenant deployment, we have the vBond and vManage as a multi-tenant elements. vSmart in our solution is a single tenant element. You can see that we have A and B as two separate tenants. That means that even though it's depicted as a single vSmart, it actually has a vSmart for B, and it also has a vSmart for A. Right? So why this was done? It's an engineering decision. The reason for it, it's an important vSmart and the edges have a very critical function across themselves in order to distribute this control plane connectivity. The decision was that we felt uncomfortable with turning the controllers, the vSmart controllers, into a multi-tenant entity in order to prevent any potential impairment to the control plane functions. So the engineering decision that we took is to make sure that the vSmart controllers are separated on a per tenant basis. They could be deployed as a virtual machines, and in order to ease some of those compute environments, they can be deployed as containers. So we talked about that everything is virtual. So vBond is a virtual machine in essence. vManage is a virtual machine. vSmart is a virtual machine or a container, which is in fact another virtual entity, but it's not a virtual machine. It's a container, right? And again, to ease some of those implementation tasks that need to be taken when you're deploying this specifically in a multi-tenant environment and spinning up a vSmart controllers on a per tenant basis. Now, when this backend is built, what you have here is similar to what we saw with dedicated tenancy, but this time it's shared infrastructure. You have the tenant A which is here, and it has its own set of VPNs if you want to do some further division. And you have the tenant B, which, as you can see, again, VPN IDs can be overlapping because these are separate tenants, even though deployed on the same infrastructure, they're treated as separate instances. Right? So this is our view for multi-tenancy. It's really that full enterprise tenancy. As we said, the vBound and vManage are shared across customers. vSmarts are deployed on per customer, and as we said, could be deployed as a virtual machine or as the container. And again, just like in previous cases, deployment model supported in all deployment models, which means cloud, Cisco Cloud, which operates like this already. You have a partner that wants to launch the service. They can operate this as a single tenant, multi-tenant, or a mix of both. And a customer who wants to treat their organization as tenants and they want to treat themselves as the service providers, they can also launch this approach in their own on-prem deployment. And again, VPN segregation is something which we see prevalent in all the deployment models, but again, a layer on top of the multi-tenancy.
So David, when would I use one versus another when I look at WRF-based multi-tenancy or the controller-based multi-tenancy?
It's a good question. I think if you are from the traditional sort of the way that multi-tenancy is perceived in the, let's say, service provider market and enterprise market, what we're seeing here is truly the definition of multi-tenancy, the way that it's recognized by the industry. So if you were to ask sort of a common person what multi-tenancy is, they would probably describe this. Right? This is what the enterprises and the service providers expect from multi-tenancy. The single tenancy is sort of an obvious, I want a dedicated system to myself, and a VPN tenancy is a bit of a hybrid of the two. Again, not a very predominant one. I'm not sure that I would recommend that model unless, if you recall, that recommendation for making sure that your operational model is such that you don't inadvertently impact across customers, which is not possible in this case because tenants are strictly isolated. So there's nobody who can sort of like administratively go into the vManage and just somehow trigger an action that would enforce a certain behavior on another tenant. vManage is sort of internally subdivided into this tenants. So an action on tenant 1 is not going to have any bearing on tenant 2. I think this is a more straightforward definition. If you are an organization and you just want segmentation and you don't truly want tenancy constructs, then the previous example of VPN segmentation is more than enough. But if you're looking for sort of a more true industry-recognized way of describing or developing, delivering multi-tenancy, is really this enterprise tenancy model.
Okay, thank you.
All right, guys, that's all I have. Do you have any questions?
No, we're good.
All right.
Thank you, David. Reviewing what we've learned today. In this session, we saw that there are a number of SD-WAN capabilities, but the main things to remember are that they can be consumed in 3 main ways. 1, through Cisco as a service. 2, through a partner. Or 3, within your own infrastructure and consuming the SD-WAN service there. Thank you.